I was 28 years old, trying to chase my dream of becoming a successful author by writing for a prominent newspaper. But things didn't work out. I had just returned home to help my aging parents run the family farm. It wasn't the future I had imagined when I left home years ago, but they were getting older, and managing the farm on their own was becoming increasingly difficult. The farm was quiet and remote, surrounded by endless fields of corn stretching as far as the eye could see. Our nearest neighbor lived about a 10-minute walk away, a small farm owned by an elderly woman named Mrs. Dawson, who'd been on her own since her husband passed away a few years earlier. Life in the countryside was slow, but I didn't mind. At that stage in my life, slow was exactly what I needed. Things were pretty normal for the first couple of weeks as I adjusted to the farm's routines. The relaxed pace was actually beneficial, giving me plenty of time to think and write, which is what I spent most of my nights doing. I've always found that I'm most creative at night, so I'd get all the farm chores done well before sunset, and then write until I could barely keep my eyes open. I decided to stay in the small bedroom on the third floor to avoid disturbing my parents with my odd sleeping habits. I liked it up there. It was cozy and quiet, and the view from the window was truly inspirational, a picturesque scene of the sprawling farm. But after about another week, I noticed something strange. Every evening just before sunset, I'd see a figure standing at the far edge of the cornfield, between two rows of corn. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was someone from Mrs. Dawson's farm, maybe checking on their crops or surveying the land. They weren't trespassing, so I didn't see any harm in it. However, it was unsettling. The figure didn't move or wave, it just stood there almost like a scarecrow or statue. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, or even which way they were facing. The eerie stillness of the figure sent shivers down my spine, but I brushed it off, thinking it was nothing to worry about. I even noted how the scene would make a striking photograph, with the silhouette standing against the golden sky and an ocean of corn. Days went by, and the figure kept appearing, always at the same time and in roughly the same spot. One night, I watched it more intently, determined to prove to myself that it wasn't just a scarecrow. After a while, I noticed it shift slightly, confirming it was a person. It was strange, but I kept telling myself there was no real threat. I even considered the possibility that it might be Mrs. Dawson herself, though I hadn't seen her in the time I'd been back. After all, how much danger could an elderly woman pose? But as you can guess, I wouldn't be writing this if everything had stayed innocent. Things took a turn. The figure started moving closer. Each night, it would be between a different set of corn rows, each time a little nearer to the house. It was getting concerning. Whoever it was had a clear intention. They were steadily encroaching on our property. After 2 nights of this, I decided to tell my parents. My mom dismissed it, saying it was probably Mrs. Dawson's son, who had always been a bit eccentric. My mom had a way of downplaying things, but calling him eccentric was putting it mildly. To my surprise, neither of my parents seemed particularly worried. They told me to leave him be, as he was supposedly harmless. But one evening, as I was finishing up chores in the barn, I glanced toward the cornfield and felt my stomach drop. The figure was now right at the edge of our property, far closer than before. A chill ran through me. I wiped my hands on my jeans, feeling a mixture of unease and irritation, and decided to confront whoever it was. I walked toward the cornfield, yelling, "Who's there?" But as I got closer, the figure suddenly turned and bolted into the corn. I chased after them but lost sight of the person almost immediately as they disappeared among the stalks. My heart pounded as I stood there, realizing there was no way I'd be able to find them in the maze of corn. Even if it was just a troubled local, the whole situation felt dangerously wrong. The next morning, I went to speak with Miss Dawson. She seemed confused when I told her about the figure. She explained that she hadn't been outside after dark in weeks due to her health. When I asked about her son, she said he had moved away years ago and hadn't been back. A wave of dread washed over me as I realized the person I had seen wasn't her son. It was a complete stranger. I hurried home and told my parents. This time they seemed genuinely worried, though my dad didn't think the police would be of much help, since no crime had technically been committed. My dad told me to stay alert and wake him if the figure came back. For the next few nights, nothing happened, and I began to hope that whoever it was had been scared off. But then one evening I was working in the barn when everything suddenly went dark. The entire farm was plunged into pitch blackness. The power had gone out. I never carried my phone into the barn, so I was left fumbling in the dark. My heart raced as I felt a creeping sense of dread. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, only to hear rustling coming from the cornfield. I turned the flashlight beam toward the sound, trying to stay quiet. My hands were shaking. At first I saw nothing, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. A man emerged from the darkness, just a few feet away from the barn. He was balding, with a few tufts of hair, wearing dirty overalls. His face was twisted in a menacing expression, and he clutched a rusty garden trowel. Panic flooded my body, and I ran, hearing his footsteps thundering behind me. I sprinted into the cornfield, trying to lose him. I dove into a row of corn, heart pounding, barely able to breathe. A few moments later, I saw him rush past me, searching. It was the most terrifying experience of my life. I waited, frozen, until I was sure he was gone, then bolted back to the house. Still shaking, I called the police. They searched the area but found nothing, except evidence that someone had dumped water on our breaker, causing the outage. The next day, we installed extra security measures. I only stayed at the farm for another month, and nothing else happened. But it haunted me to leave my parents there, knowing someone dangerous was still out there. They ended up hiring a farmhand to help out, so I was no longer needed. The experience remains one of the most unsettling events of my life, and I think about it often. This happened when I was a kid, so some of the details are a bit fuzzy, but I still remember the important parts clearly. I grew up in Nebraska, and I used to ride my bike to school every day because my parents were always working. It was just easier that way. We lived in a rural area surrounded by farmland, and the road to school took me past this enormous cornfield. Looking back, it probably wasn't as big as it seemed, but as a kid, it felt like it went on forever. Our house was on the far side of the field, and my parents were always adamant about one rule: never cut through the cornfield. They were worried I'd get lost without a phone, and I didn't really question it. I had seen firsthand how easy it was to lose your sense of direction in there. So every day I'd stick to the main road and bike all the way around the field. I didn't have many friends who lived nearby, so I always rode alone. I didn't mind, though I actually grew to love biking. I'd even go for rides on weekends when I didn't need to. One day, it was a typical weekday afternoon, and I was biking home from school when the chain on my bike suddenly popped loose. I don't recall exactly how it happened, but it came off entirely, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get it back on. My dad had shown me how to fix it, but nothing I tried worked. I was stuck. The thought of walking all the way home with my bike in tow sounded dreadful. Like I said, I didn't have a phone, so calling my parents for help wasn't an option. I knew better than to hitch a ride from a stranger, so I was on my own. That's when I glanced over at the cornfield. Taking the normal route home would take forever, but cutting through the cornfield would save me a ton of time. I knew my parents had warned me against it, but I figured it couldn't be that hard to navigate. Just walk straight, I thought. So I made up my mind and pushed my bike into the cornfield, convincing myself it'd be a quick shortcut. At first, it was fine. The narrow path between the rows of corn was clear enough to walk through. The stalks towered over me, and I remember a gentle breeze rustling through them. As a kid, the stalks felt 10 times taller, and everything seemed so much bigger. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. The corn blocked out a lot of light, and it was eerily quiet. Every so often I'd look behind me, though I didn't know why. I just had this unsettling feeling, and I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. After a few more minutes, I started hearing a faint rustling sound coming from the corn, just a little way off the path. I stopped and listened, trying to tell myself it was just the wind. But it didn't sound like the wind. The noise stopped when I stood still, but as soon as I started walking again, it picked up, louder and closer. I wondered if it might be an animal, but I couldn't think of any animal that would make that much noise. My chest tightened, and I struggled to breathe. I wished more than anything that I hadn't gone into that cornfield. I walked faster, refusing to leave my bike behind. I'm just being paranoid, I kept telling myself. But every few minutes, the rustling came back, like something was following me. Then, abruptly, it stopped, and I felt a brief wave of relief. I didn't hear anything strange for what felt like 10 minutes. I decided to switch roads to be safe and turned a corner. That's when I saw him, a man standing in the middle of the path, arms hanging at his sides, staring at me. He didn't look like a farmer or anyone who belonged out there. His clothes were filthy and torn, and his arms had these long, deep scratches. I don't know how else to describe them. They looked like wounds etched into his skin. I froze, unsure of what to do. He asked if I was lost in a low, raspy voice. I couldn't respond. I was rooted to the spot. Then he stepped toward me, saying he'd help me find my way home. I felt paralyzed, like I was in a nightmare. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. As he got closer, I finally snapped out of it. I dropped my bike and ran as fast as I could. He started chasing me, yelling that he just wanted to help. I didn't stop running. I could hear him crashing through the corn behind me, shouting for me to wait. I finally ducked between some corn stalks and crouched down, trying to make myself as small as possible, eyes squeezed shut. I was sure I was going to die. I remember seeing him pass by, clutching something that looked like a rope. He muttered, "I'll find him." Those words are burned into my memory. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours. My whole body was trembling, but I didn't move until I was sure he was gone. When I finally crawled out, it was dark. I stumbled home, barely able to walk. My parents were frantic, and I told them everything. My mom was in tears and my dad looked ready to hunt the man down, but there wasn't much they could do. My dad went back to look for my bike, but it was gone. A few days later, they got me a new one, and life carried on, sort of. But then, a few weeks later, something happened that made us move. I got home from school, and there it was, my old bike, propped up on our porch. I don't know who was more freaked out, me or my parents. They decided we couldn't stay there any longer, and we moved not long after. My parents don't talk about it, but I'll never forget. The old Victorian house stood solemnly at the end of Willow Lane, wrapped in shadows cast by the dense forest surrounding it. The Parker family, David, his wife Emily, and their 7-year-old daughter Chloe, had driven nearly 10 hours to get here, hoping to find solace in the quiet countryside. The promise of a fresh start had lured them to this forgotten corner of Maine, where the air was crisp and the nights were eerily silent. As they stepped out of the car, the wind rustled through the trees, whispering secrets they couldn't understand. Emily shivered, but she brushed it off as fatigue from the long journey. "This is it," David said, forcing a smile as he opened the creaky front gate. "Our new home." Chloe ran ahead, her laughter ringing out across the neglected front yard. Emily watched her daughter's blonde curls bounce with each step and felt a fleeting sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this move would be good for them. But hope is fragile, and as they entered the house, a sense of unease crept over Emily. The air inside felt heavy, laden with dust and something she couldn't quite name. The grand staircase spiraled upward, disappearing into the gloom of the second floor, and the wooden floors groaned under their weight, as if the house itself was alive. The whispers begin. It started the first night. Emily woke to the sound of whispers, soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to float through the walls. She sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. The whispers grew louder, but she couldn't make out the words. Goosebumps prickled her skin as she nudged David awake. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. David groaned and rubbed his eyes. "Hear what?" Emily held her breath. The whispers had stopped. The house was silent once more, save for the wind rattling the old window panes. Shaking her head, she tried to convince herself that it had been her imagination. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The next morning, Chloe was unusually quiet at breakfast. She pushed her cereal around her bowl, her eyes downcast. "What's wrong, sweetie?" Emily asked, brushing a strand of hair from Chloe's face. Chloe looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "There are people in the walls," she whispered. David and Emily exchanged worried glances. "What do you mean, honey?" David asked gently. Chloe hesitated, her small fingers gripping the spoon. "I heard them last night. They were talking to me." Emily couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that had settled deep in her bones. As the days passed, the house began to reveal its secrets. Strange noises became a nightly occurrence. Footsteps creaking across the hall, doors closing on their own, and those relentless, insidious whispers that seemed to follow Emily wherever she went. One evening, after putting Chloe to bed, Emily found herself wandering the house in a restless daze. David was out in the shed, trying to fix a broken lawnmower, leaving her alone with the haunting stillness. She climbed the stairs slowly, her bare feet making no sound on the worn wooden steps. As she reached the second floor, she noticed Chloe's bedroom door was slightly ajar. Emily pushed it open gently, expecting to see her daughter fast asleep. Instead, she froze. Chloe was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide open and unblinking, staring at something in the corner of the room. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Chloe, you doing?" she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. Chloe didn't move. "She's singing to me," the little girl said, her voice distant and dreamlike. Emily's stomach twisted. "Who's singing to you, honey?" Chloe raised a trembling hand and pointed to the shadowy corner. Emily turned her gaze, her heart hammering in her chest. The corner was empty, but the air felt colder, almost suffocating. Emily could almost hear it now, a faint melodic lullaby, as if someone were humming just beyond her reach. With a burst of panic, Emily rushed to Chloe's side, pulling the girl into her arms. Chloe's small body was cold, and she clung to her mother as if waking from a nightmare. "Don't listen to her, Mommy," Chloe whispered. "She wants me to follow her into the walls." Emily didn't sleep that night. She lay beside Chloe, her eyes wide open, listening to the house breathe around them. The history of Willow Lane. The next morning, Emily decided she couldn't take it anymore. She had to know what they were dealing with. While David took Chloe into town to buy groceries, Emily stayed behind, determined to learn the truth about the house. She grabbed her laptop and started researching the history of Willow Lane and the old Victorian they now called home. It didn't take long to uncover a series of disturbing stories. The house had belonged to the Hawthorne family in the early 1900s. Tragedy had struck one fateful winter when the youngest Hawthorne daughter, Margaret, had gone missing. She had been just 7 years old, the same age as Chloe. The family had searched desperately for weeks, but Margaret was never found. Rumors spread that the girl's ghost still wandered the house, searching for a way out. Emily's hands trembled as she scrolled through old newspaper articles. Some stories claimed that the Hawthorne family had practiced dark rituals, summoning spirits to communicate with their lost daughter. Others whispered about the house itself, calling it a living entity that fed on the souls of the innocent. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. Emily jumped, nearly knocking over her coffee. She raced up the stairs, her pulse pounding, and burst into Chloe's room. The window was wide open, the curtains billowing in the wind. Chloe's bed was empty. "Chloe?" Emily called out, her voice cracking. Panic surged through her veins as she searched the house, her mind racing with terrifying possibilities. She found Chloe standing in front of the basement door, her hand hovering over the knob. Emily's heart nearly stopped. "Chloe, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice a desperate whisper. Chloe turned to her, her eyes glassy and unfocused. "She wants me to go down there," she said. "She said it's where the secrets are." Emily grabbed Chloe's hand and pulled her away from the door. "We're not going anywhere," she said, her voice shaking. "Not down there." But deep in the shadows of the basement, something or someone was waiting. That night, Emily and David argued for the first time since moving in. Emily insisted that they needed to leave, that the house was dangerous, but David, ever the skeptic, dismissed her concerns as stress and exhaustion. "It's just an old house," he said, rubbing his temples. "We put all our savings into this place. We can't just up and leave." Emily clenched her fists, feeling the frustration and fear boiling inside her. "Something is wrong here, David. Chloe is scared." "I'm scared. We can't ignore this." David sighed, but before he could respond, a sudden thump echoed from the basement. They both froze. The sound was unmistakable, the heavy, deliberate footsteps of something moving below. David grabbed a flashlight and, despite Emily's protests, made his way to the basement door. He opened it slowly, the old hinges screeching in protest. The darkness beyond seemed to breathe, and the smell of damp earth wafted up to meet them. "Stay here," David said, his voice barely more than a whisper. He descended the stairs, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the shadows. Emily stood at the top, her heart in her throat, listening as David called out. The silence that followed was deafening, and then she heard it, a blood-curdling scream, followed by a crash. Emily didn't think she just ran, bolting down the basement steps. The air was freezing, and the shadows seemed to writhe and reach for her. She found David on the ground, the flashlight lying a few feet away, its beam illuminating a patch of dirt that had been disturbed, as if something or someone had been buried there. David's face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "Emily," he whispered, his voice broken. There's something down here." The whisper started again, louder this time, echoing off the cold stone walls. Emily grabbed David's arm, and together they stumbled up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind them. But they knew. The house had secrets buried deep within, and it wasn't done with them yet. As the days went on, the house seemed to grow more restless. Chloe became quieter, her once bright laughter now replaced by fear. Emily and David barely slept, haunted by dreams of shadowy figures and cold hands reaching for them in the dark. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily sat with Chloe in her room, reading her a bedtime story. Chloe clung to her small body trembling. "Mommy," Chloe whispered, "she says she wants to be free. She says she's trapped because of the bad things that happened." Emily's heart ached. "Who, sweetie? Who's trapped?" Chloe's eyes filled with tears. "Margaret, she's scared and she's sad. She wants us to help her." Emily held Chloe close, a surge of determination rising within her. If the house wanted to play games, she would face it head-on. That night, Emily returned to the basement. This time she came armed with a shovel and a will stronger than her fear. David begged her not to go, but she knew they had no choice. The house wouldn't rest until the truth was unearthed. The basement was colder than ever, and as Emily dug into the disturbed earth, the whispers grew louder, almost desperate. Finally, her shovel hit something solid. She dropped to her knees and pulled away the dirt, revealing a small, rotting wooden box. Emily pried the box open, her hands shaking. Inside was a collection of old, decaying dolls, a child's hair ribbon, and a worn diary. The whispers stopped, replaced by a sudden, suffocating silence. Emily opened the diary, the pages brittle with age. The final entry was scrawled in shaky handwriting. "They won't let me leave. The walls keep me here. I want to go home." Tears streamed down Emily's face as she whispered, "We'll set you free, Margaret. I promise." Emily and David gathered Chloe and stood together in the living room, clutching the diary. They spoke to the house, to the spirits that lingered, promising to honor the past and let Margaret go. The air grew heavy, and then, like a breath held too long, it released. The whispers faded, and a warmth filled the house. For the first time in weeks, the Parkers felt at peace. Chloe smiled, a light returning to her eyes. "She's gone now," Chloe said, her voice soft. She said, "Thank you." Emily hugged her daughter, feeling the weight of fear lift from her shoulders. The house had shared its story, and in return, it had found rest. But as they packed their belongings to leave Willow Lane for good, Emily couldn't help but wonder, had they truly heard the last of the whispers, or had the house only begun to tell its tale? I live with my boyfriend Mika in the house he owns. It's a modest place in a good neighborhood where violent crime is typically low. I say modest because compared to other homes in the area, it's on the smaller side. Still, having a smaller house here is desirable, allowing us to enjoy a nice town without the price tag of a multi-million-dollar home. It's a single-story, 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house with a basement, located on a very quiet block that offers a lot of privacy. The street curves in a way that means no houses directly face ours, which is perfect for privacy. Our block only has 8 houses, and further down is a small wooded area. Last October, Mika went to Vegas for a bachelor party, leaving me alone from Thursday to Monday. On Friday after work, I had some girlfriends over for a wine night. We were in the living room, watching scary movies, when the doorbell rang. We all went silent, looking at each other in shock. The idea of the doorbell ringing late at night while watching horror movies felt almost surreal. I crept over to see if I could spot who was outside, but the window didn't give me a clear view. The door has a tiny glass panel at the top, so I peeked through it. We had 4 cars in the driveway, so whoever it was had to know someone was home, but I didn't see anyone on the porch. I went back to my friends, and while we all agreed it was strange, we wrote it off as an unfortunate case of ding-dong ditching. After everyone left, I went to bed. Not even an hour later, the doorbell rang twice, waking me up. I checked my phone. It was 1 a.m. No one should be outside your door at that hour. I immediately called Mika, who sounded very drunk and had to step into a bathroom to hear me over the noise. He told me to stay in the bedroom and not to open the door, but he didn't suggest calling the police, so I didn't. After the call, I tried to calm down and go back to sleep. Just as I was starting to relax, I heard clicking noises outside. Then, there was a knock at the window, followed by a man's voice. "Hey, anyone home? I need some help out here." I was grateful that the blinds were closed, so whoever was out there couldn't see me. The man knocked again and said, "I know you're home." That was the breaking point. I called the police, whispering into the phone the entire time, afraid he could hear me. I told them someone was trying to break in and asked them to come quickly. Within 5 to 10 minutes, the doorbell rang again, followed by loud knocks. I approached the door and asked, "Who is it?" A man's voice answered, "It's the police." It sounded different from the previous voice. I peeked through the glass and saw 2 police officers. I opened the door, and the taller officer immediately walked in, uninvited. He said they were responding to my call about a disturbance. I told him about the man lurking around, but this officer was the rudest person I've ever encountered. He kept talking over me, telling me to shush, and seemed to be on some sort of power trip. His partner stayed silent the whole time. The taller officer asked questions I couldn't answer, like what the man looked like, even though I'd clearly said I hadn't seen him. At one point, he said, "Well, you're the one who called us, ma'am. If you don't want our help, we can leave." I was stunned and apologized, saying I was just scared. They eventually did a brief walk around the house with flashlights but didn't check thoroughly. I watched them through the windows, and when they came back, they told me there wasn't much they could do without proof or cameras. They left, and I didn't feel any safer, but at least I'd called for help. I went back to bed, and thankfully the next time I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the blinds. It was 10 a.m. on Saturday, and I had plans to help set up for a Halloween party at my friend's house. During the day, I did some grocery shopping and picked up things for the party. I was going as Velma from Scooby-Doo, and my friend hosting the party was going as Daphne. The party started at 9 p.m. and got busy around 10:30. I stayed until a little after 1 a.m., but I hadn't had much to drink, so I was good to drive home. When I got home, I immediately noticed a cool draft. After putting my things down, I realized one of the windows was open. I went to close it, trying to remember why it would be open in the first place. Then, as I came out of the bathroom, I saw that the basement door was wide open. I froze. There was a faint but consistent clicking sound coming from the basement. When I approached the stairs, the noise suddenly stopped, and a voice from the darkness said, "You're finally home." I slammed the basement door shut and grabbed my phone, running outside to my neighbor's house. I banged on the door until they answered, and I called the police from the safety of their home. It was the same 2 officers who showed up, but having my neighbor with me seemed to change the taller cop's attitude. He wasn't as rude this time. The officers searched the house while my neighbor and I waited in the living room. I pointed out places someone might hide, and they checked everything. While I was on the phone with Mika, who was still drunk in Vegas, we eventually confirmed that no one was left in the house. I packed a bag and stayed with my sister until Mika came back. Before leaving, I locked every single window. We still live in the same house, but for months I refused to be there alone for long periods. I still get PTSD from that night, and I sometimes have nightmares about hearing knocks at the window, only to wake up in a panic. I'm a 20-year-old guy working as a pharmacy technician at a medium-sized hospital in Northwest Alabama. I work the early night shift from 6 p.m. to 4 a.m. and am responsible for stocking the surgery rooms. My schedule is 7 days on, followed by 7 days off. Working 7 nights straight can be rough, but having a full week off afterward feels amazing. My shifts run from Thursday to Wednesday. On my 6th night, a Tuesday, I left work a little early to stay with my wife at her aunt's house, which was about 30 minutes from our own home. She was babysitting her little cousins while her aunt and uncle were on a trip. The house didn't have curtains, so she felt uneasy staying there alone. I hadn't gone to stay with her initially because I'd be getting there around 5 a.m., only to fall asleep as the sun rose. But on her last night of babysitting, she felt extra anxious, so I decided to come over. Despite being stubborn, she was grateful when I showed up. Working the night shift for the past 2 years has taken a toll on me, and I've developed some mild insomnia. Even after arriving at my wife's aunt's house, I just couldn't fall asleep. I'd never stayed awake for more than 28 hours straight before, but that night was different. We had a busy day ahead, dropping her cousins off at school, attending a gender reveal party for a friend, going grocery shopping, and then my 6 p.m. shift at work. I ended up dozing off in the car for less than 10 minutes, but the wave of exhaustion soon hit me again. I grabbed a massive Red Bull and another energy drink when I got to work. My wife had to drive me to and from work since my car needed its brakes fixed, and neither of us trusted me to drive hers after being up for over 24 hours. It was Wednesday night, and I'd been awake since 2 p.m. on Tuesday. My shift started off fine, and as long as I stayed busy, the tiredness didn't really get to me. I had my earbuds in, listening to music as I stocked the surgery rooms with medications. It was a weeknight, so there were still a few late surgeries wrapping up, and housekeeping was cleaning up some operating rooms. It's not unusual for surgery staff to come into the room I'm in to grab something, so I always turn around and give them a smile, which they usually return. This time, I was stocking the Omnicell machine with meds when I heard the door behind me open. The door let out a high-pitched squeal, the kind that happens when hinges need oiling, followed by the loud crash of it closing. I turned around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one there. I brushed it off, figuring they must have seen me, and decided to check another room. I pushed my cart to the next room, where the light was off. As I opened the door, I thought I saw someone hunched over the Omnicell, rummaging through the sharps bin. If you don't know, that's where we dispose of used needles and vials. Someone had been caught doing that once before, searching for morphine, and got fired. I flipped on the light, ready to confront them, but there was no one there. That's when I started feeling uneasy. I wondered if I was hallucinating from lack of sleep since I'd been up for over 24 hours. I told myself to calm down and finished stocking the surgery rooms without further incident. At 2 a.m., I had to deliver patient-specific medications to the nurses' stations on each floor. Each floor of the hospital is laid out the same, with 3 elevators in the center. If you go left from the elevators, you reach the 51 and 52 wings, and if you go right, you reach the 54 and 55 wings. Each wing has 15 patient rooms. Recently, the 5th floor's 54 and 55 side had been undergoing remodeling, so patients from that section had been moved to the 3rd floor. The 54 and 55 side was completely empty. I made my way up, delivering meds floor by floor until I reached the 5th. I finished delivering to the 51 and 52 side and decided to check out the progress on the 54 and 55 side. Walking down those empty hallways felt unnerving. The silence combined with the desolate rooms was unsettling. As I passed room 5512, I heard a noise, a bed rattling violently. I peeked inside and saw an old man having what looked like a seizure. Blood was streaming from his eyes, nose and mouth, and he made these guttural, gargling sounds like a zombie from The Walking Dead. A monitor was beeping frantically, as it does when a patient is coding. My heart dropped, and I stepped behind the door frame in shock. But when I stepped back into the room, there was no one there. The bed was neatly made, the monitor was off, and the room looked like it hadn't been occupied in days. Convinced I was hallucinating, I made my way back to the elevators. As the doors opened on the 1st floor, an old man in a security uniform with a hospital badge stepped in. He patted me on the shoulder as he passed, and my stomach turned. It was the same man I'd seen in room 5512. He smiled as the doors closed, and I watched the elevator numbers light up as it went back to the 5th floor. I didn't press the button, but the elevator soon returned to the 1st floor, empty. I ran back to the pharmacy and stayed there for the rest of my shift. As I waited for my wife to pick me up, I Googled when hallucinations start from sleep deprivation. It said between 30 and 48 hours, and I was at hour 38. It made sense, but it still felt all too real. The pharmacy is right below the 54 and 55 side, so when I walk in, I can see the windows on those floors. As I left work and got into my wife's car, I glanced up at the 5th floor window. The same old man was staring back at me. Chills ran down my spine, but I didn't tell my wife what I saw. I'm not sure why I hallucinated that specific man. I've never seen him before. Even now, I'm still unsure if it was all in my head or if I experienced something real. It certainly felt real. I went straight to sleep when I got home, and while I haven't seen that man again, the experience is still fresh in my mind. It happened less than 2 weeks ago, and I can't shake the feeling. This happened when I was 18. I'm 22 now and living in San Antonio, Texas. It was my senior year of high school, right when COVID-19 started blowing up, causing everything to shut down, including my school. Despite everyone being supposed to stay home in quarantine, my friends and I actually went out more than ever. There wasn't much to do since all non-essential businesses were closed. But one thing about me, I've always loved urban exploring and visiting haunted places, and I still do to this day. I'm not someone who scares easily. I've had run-ins with homeless people, stumbled upon cult gatherings, and even had a gun pointed at me. But nothing compares to the strange and creepy experience I had during one particular exploration. Around this time, I started talking to a girl from my high school named Clarissa. We had shared a class together, and we were just starting to date. If it weren't for her backing up my story, I doubt any of my friends would have believed what happened that night. Somehow, I convinced Clarissa to explore a wooded natural park at 3 a.m. It was called Opschnabel Park, and during the day, it's a beautiful and relatively safe place. But at night, it's a different story. Police often patrol the entrances to keep people away, and for good reason. In 2016, a 24-year-old woman named Lauren Bump was brutally murdered there. And in 2021, a boy was shot while exploring the woods. Clarissa and I arrived at the park around 3 a.m. It was pitch black, with the trees doing a good job of blocking out any moonlight. I usually prefer not to use my flashlight because it messes with my night vision and makes me more visible to others. Besides, I didn't want to risk someone spotting the light from a distance. We walked for about 15 or 20 minutes along the main trail, planning to make a loop that would lead us back to my truck. The night felt eerily quiet, and Clarissa seemed uneasy, so I suggested we take an off-road trail that would cut our walk short. She agreed, and we veered off the main path. We had only been on the off-road trail for a couple of minutes when we suddenly heard a flute playing. Clarissa and I froze, looking at each other in disbelief. The melody was rhythmic, like someone playing an actual piece of music. It sounded almost beautiful. But in the dead of night, it was creepy as hell. Even though I'm not easily scared, this put me on edge. Clarissa, on the other hand, was visibly terrified. She started trembling, whispering prayers, and asking God to forgive her for her sins. The sound of the flute was impossible to place. It seemed to come from the direction of the main trail, but it felt like it was getting louder and closer, as if it was right on top of us. Clarissa was so panicked that I knew I had to keep it together. "Don't worry," I whispered, trying to reassure her. "I won't let anything happen to you." It probably sounded cheesy, but I was serious. I suggested we run down the trail to get away from the sound, and we took off. As we sprinted, I could barely process what was happening. The flute may have stopped, I'm not really sure. I was too focused on getting us out of there. We only got about 30 feet when we heard rustling in the bushes and the snapping of twigs. Something large dashed across the trail right in front of us. It could have been a deer or another animal, but it was strange. I could feel the size of whatever it was, like a rush of wind passing us, but I never saw a silhouette or any shape. Even stranger, I didn't hear it approach or retreat, just that single dash across our path. Terrified, we turned and ran back the way we came. As we neared the original spot where we first heard the flute, the music started up again. This time it was even more unsettling. The notes were chiming, almost like an eerie Irish jig, but still impossible to pinpoint. The sound surrounded us, and my fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. We were trapped, with two equally horrifying options: run back into the dark, dense off-road trail where we'd encountered whatever dashed in front of us, or head down the main trail toward the source of the flute. I decided the main trail was the lesser of two evils since it was more open, so I grabbed Clarissa's hand and we ran. The adrenaline was so intense that we cut what would have been a 20-minute walk into a 7 or 8-minute sprint. Somewhere along the way, the flute music stopped, but I was too freaked out to notice when. As we ran, we passed a random porta potty and I felt a wave of dread. I couldn't help but imagine someone hiding inside, but thankfully, there was no sign of anyone around. We finally made it back to my truck, which was still the only vehicle in the parking area. I wasted no time getting us out of there. The next day, I told my friends the whole story and searched the internet to see if anyone else had experienced something similar. People have reported encountering ghosts, cults, and wild animals, but I couldn't find anything about a flute playing in the woods. Maybe I didn't look hard enough, but it still baffles me. The more I think about it, the more paranormal it feels rather than just scary in a tangible sense. Was it a person? A ghost? A cult? I have no idea. All I know is that I've never gone back to those woods at night. I still explore plenty of creepy places, but nothing has ever compared to that night. Just writing about it gives me chills. When we were kids, our family had a vacation spot in Hollywood, South Carolina. By we, I mean my 3 brothers and me. And by vacation spot, I mean a simple 3-bedroom mobile home. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was a huge part of our childhood, and the memories are still nostalgic. Whenever we left the highway and started driving past endless farms, we knew we were almost there. At the time of this story, I was the second oldest, and our ages were around 14, 12, 10, and 8. The mobile home was pretty basic, but at least we had electricity. We even had an old TV, good enough to hook up our PlayStation and play on. We'd been visiting this place for years, and there were a few favorite spots we always went to. There was this big playground at an elementary school where we'd play hide and seek and tag while our parents relaxed with magazines. There was also a grocery store where we made our own games, and of course we loved exploring the woods surrounding our property. The nearest neighbors weren't too far away, but it was still a decent walk. Our parents didn't mind us walking there as long as we stuck together. This year was the first time our youngest brother Todd got to come exploring with us. Our parents stayed back at the mobile home while we set off down a different road that veered away from the dead end. Traffic on these roads was practically non-existent, since the only cars passing by were from the few people who lived there. There was this strange house and farm that always looked deserted. It sat on a small hill overlooking the road with a small cornfield in front. The place always seemed suspiciously empty. We never saw any people or cars there, even though the cornfield suggested someone might still live there. The house, 2 small buildings, and the surrounding woods made it the perfect spot to play hide and seek tag. It was a bright, sunny day, and we decided to start our game. Our oldest brother, Tony, was chosen to be the seeker, and we'd go in age order from oldest to youngest. I ran into the cornfield to hide and sat down, making sure the dried, brown stalks completely concealed me. I heard Tony yell, "Ready or not, here I come." I waited quietly until I heard rustling footsteps nearby, crunching on the dry corn leaves. I didn't know if it was one of my brothers, but I wasn't willing to take any chances. I bolted out of the cornfield and ran up the hill toward a red shed, expecting Tony to come chasing after me, but he didn't. Instead, I heard him running after George, our 10-year-old brother, on the other side of the house. I could hear them laughing and shouting as Tony caught George, tagging him out. I stayed behind the shed, trying to stay hidden, and then I spotted Todd leaning against the back of the house, grinning at me. He put his finger to his lips to signal for me to be quiet, and I did the same. Then it hit me if Todd was over there, who was in the cornfield with me. Just then, Tony came around the house and tagged Todd. He spotted me too, since I was right in his line of sight, and started chasing me. I ran downhill as fast as I could, but Tony had the advantage of being bigger and faster. He caught me in no time. We all met at the bottom of the hill by the road. I was supposed to be the next seeker, but I asked if any of them had been in the cornfield. When they all said no, I felt a chill run down my spine. I told them I had heard someone in there, and it might have been the owner of the property. We decided to leave quickly and hurried back to the mobile home. Our parents were watching a movie in the living room when we got back. For dinner, we went to our favorite local pizza place. I remember our dad saying that no one actually lived in that house, which made the whole situation even stranger. When we got back, it was dark, but we still wanted to play flashlight tag. Our mom didn't want Todd coming out with us after dark, but she allowed us to go because Tony was 14, and she thought he was responsible enough. The 3 of us headed back to that eerie property. By then it was almost completely dark. This time I was the seeker. I turned around and counted to 60, then yelled, "I'm coming." I kept the flashlight off to stay hidden. I could just barely see as I navigated around. I ran up the hill and checked around the house and the shed, but I didn't see either of my brothers. I turned on the flashlight and searched the trees, but still found nothing. It seemed obvious that one of them would be hiding in the cornfield. I crept quietly into the cornfield, trying not to make too much noise. It was so much scarier in the dark. As I moved through the crops, I heard footsteps again, and I knew I had to be sneaky if I wanted to catch them. When I got close, I turned on the flashlight and yelled, "Caught you." But instead of one of my brothers, I saw the back of a figure running away. I shouted, "Who is that?" "You're out." But then I heard this unsettling laughter. It didn't sound like a child's laugh. It was the eerie, deranged laugh of an adult. I froze, moving only my flashlight to search for the source of the noise. A man's voice whispered, "Can I play with you guys?" I saw part of his face through the crops. It looked deformed, and I couldn't tell if he was wearing a mask or if it was real. I turned and bolted out of the cornfield, yelling for my brothers to run. I saw them both, and they had already turned their flashlights on. We all sprinted down the road, not stopping until we reached our property. Out of breath, I told them what I saw. They looked terrified. When we told our parents, they seemed confused, and our mom insisted that we never leave the property after dark again. I had trouble sleeping that night, wondering if that man was lurking outside. We never went back to that property, and thankfully, it wasn't too close to ours. A few years later, my family sold that mobile home, but I'll never forget the night we encountered that deformed man in the cornfield. I live on a farm with my brother Ben and his wife. We split up the responsibilities during the busy season, and in the off-season, they often go off traveling. My fiancée passed away a few years ago, and I haven't really tried to put myself back out there since. I spend a lot of time alone, and the off-seasons can be pretty rough for me. This all happened in early October, just before our last harvest. My brother Ben and his wife were out of town for a few days, and of course something crazy had to happen while I was holding down the fort on my own. It was an ordinary night, and I had the windows open to let the crisp October air flow through the house. Suddenly, I heard a scream from outside. It was a woman's scream, high-pitched and blood-curdling. I couldn't tell if it belonged to a teenage girl or a grown woman, but it made my heart race. I jumped up from my recliner and rushed to my gun safe in the bedroom to grab my rifle. I stepped out into the chilly, breezy night, pausing on the front porch to listen. The scream rang out again, coming from the cornfield. I fired a warning shot into the air, unsure if it was a prank or someone in genuine distress. A few seconds later, I heard a woman's voice yell, "Help," before everything fell silent. I shouted, "Who's out there? Where are you?" But all I heard was the wind rustling through the corn. I turned on all the exterior lights around the house, grabbed my phone, and called 911 while cautiously walking into the cornfield, calling out for whoever needed help. After I explained everything to the 911 operator, I waited for the police to arrive. 4 officers eventually showed up, and together we searched the cornfield with flashlights, shouting for anyone who might be there. When someone reports hearing screams for help, the police tend to take it seriously. But after a thorough search, we found no one. One of the officers told me to call 911 again if I heard anything else, and assured me they'd be close by. After they left, I took one last look at the cornfield before going back inside, locking up and shutting off the lights. It wasn't hard to imagine that local teens might be pulling a prank. There's not much to do around here, so it didn't seem too far-fetched. About an hour later, I went upstairs to bed. I took some melatonin, hoping it would help me sleep, as I'm a chronic insomniac. I'd say it's usually a curse, but not that night. After about an hour, I heard creaking sounds coming from downstairs. It hit me that I'd forgotten to close the windows. The house has thin walls, and the old wooden floors are noisy, so I could hear every sound. I grabbed my phone and quietly called Ben, whispering, asking if he had come home early. He said no. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I whispered that there was someone in the house and asked him to call the police for me, since we'd get the same dispatch center. He hung up and did just that, no questions asked. I tiptoed to my gun safe as quietly as possible, but the floorboards creaked, and I knew I'd made a noise. From downstairs, I could hear footsteps, and it was clear someone was there. I cracked open the bedroom door and looked down the staircase. The breeze was still coming through the open windows. My heart was pounding as I inched down the stairs, trying to be silent. Then, I saw a tall, skinny figure appear at the bottom of the steps. I aimed my shotgun and said, "Don't move," but he didn't listen. Instead, he calmly walked out of view, and then I heard him break into a run through the living room and out the back door. I shouted, "Stop," and briefly chased after him, but stopped as soon as he was out of the house. I locked the door, called Ben again, and he said the cops were on their way. When the same officers returned, they searched the property thoroughly. One officer even stayed on site for the night, but the intruder never came back. I didn't think he would after seeing that I was armed, Still, the story wasn't over. A few days later, while I was finishing the last harvest in the combine, I noticed something unusual in the field. It was a shoe, a woman's shoe, size 8.5. I immediately thought about the screams I had heard and the man who broke into my house. I called 911 again and left the shoe where I found it, not wanting to disturb any evidence. The police returned and searched the area, even bringing in dogs to try to pick up a scent. Strangely, there weren't any reports of a missing woman in the county, not at that time at least. I still wonder about that shoe and hope that whoever it belonged to is safe. It makes me sick to think that someone might have been harmed on my farm. My childhood friend Alex moved away with his family to a really remote town in Michigan, but we've always kept in touch. His family has always been pretty outdoorsy, and I'd even say they lean a bit redneck, so moving there made total sense. They've always loved me and welcomed me to visit whenever. We're both 19 now. I'm in college and Alex works for his dad. They own a massive property up there. I had visited before, so this wasn't my first trip. It was a fall weekend, and I planned to stay at Alex's family home. His mom and younger brother wouldn't be around that weekend. It would just be him and his dad. It's a 4.5-hour drive to get there, through farmland and open fields. To reach their property, you take a gravel road that's about 300 feet off the main road. When I arrived, Alex and his dad were already in the backyard drinking beers. After I brought my bag in from the car, I joined them. Alex was telling me about the trails in the area, suggesting we take my Toyota 4Runner off-roading. I'd never been off-roading before, but I was excited to try. Alex's dad grilled us some burgers, then left to visit a friend. Alex and I hopped in my car, and he directed me to a nearby trail he said was perfect for off-roading. It was around 6 p.m., so we only had a couple of hours of daylight left. We drove around off-roading for about an hour on different trails, not too far from Alex's house. As it got darker, we left the trails and headed back to the main road. In the woods, the darkness seemed heavier. While driving past some farmland, we came across this old abandoned building that looked like a church, with a big cornfield beside it. Alex mentioned he passes it all the time but never went to check it out. So naturally, we agreed to come back later to explore. Alex suggested taking their mountain bikes, which were fully equipped with lights. We headed back to his house, where Alex packed a backpack with some tequila, Sprite, and a couple of flashlights. We grabbed 2 of their best mountain bikes, each with mounted night lights. Alex said it would be about a 20-minute bike ride, but both of us have always been into fitness, so I didn't mind. By the time we reached the abandoned building, it was pretty dark. The grass around it was overgrown. We made sure no cars were coming before sneaking onto the property. We hid the bikes in the cornfield to keep them out of sight. There was still just enough light to move around without using our flashlights, and we didn't want to be too obvious. We were hoping to get some cool, artsy shots for Instagram inside the building if we could find a way in. It was definitely an old church. The shape of the windows gave it away. We tried peering through one of the windows, but it was too dark to see anything. I asked Alex for a flashlight, and the light made a huge difference. We both noticed something strange in one of the pews. It looked like a person's head slumped over, facing away from us. Alex thought it was probably a mannequin, given how still it was. We made a friendly bet. Alex was sure it was a mannequin, and I was betting it was some drunk homeless guy. We approached the front door, but it was boarded up. Alex tried to pull it just to see if it would budge, but there was no way. He laughed, saying he must have won the bet since a homeless person couldn't have gotten inside. I insisted we check the other windows for a better view. We moved around to another side window, the one with the best angle of whatever we'd seen. But when I shined the flashlight in, the figure that was sitting there was gone. I joked that Alex owed me money because I'd been right, though it was actually terrifying. He asked, "Where did it go?" We both started scanning with the flashlight. At the same moment we saw it and jumped. A man was standing near the window, inside the church, staring right at us. He didn't look like a homeless man at all. We bolted back to the cornfield, frantically trying to find the bikes. It was so dark that we didn't dare turn on the flashlights. We heard a loud slam from the church. It sounded like a door. Alex told me to be quiet because he could hear movement in the cornfield, like someone pushing through the crops. Then it stopped. Everything went silent. We crouched down, too afraid to move. After a solid minute, Alex whispered that we should ditch the bikes and run. Just as he said that, we heard someone barreling toward us through the crops. I yelled, "Go," and we sprinted, getting smacked in the face by the stalks as we ran. We finally broke out onto the road, and the sounds of chasing stopped. Alex called his dad, who came to get us. His dad wasn't mad about us trespassing or drinking, just upset about the bikes. He said we did the right thing by running. The next day, he took us back to get the bikes, bringing his gun along. We found them and loaded them into his truck. As we were about to leave, we glanced back at the church and saw someone at the window again. When he noticed us looking, he slowly backed away. Alex's dad, who's normally unshakable, said we should leave immediately. For him to be rattled was unnerving. Afterwards, we grabbed barbecue and some drinks. Alex's dad reported the incident to the local authorities. At least we did our part, but who knows if that man is still lurking there or who he really. When Abby Miller returned to Cedar Hollow to handle her late grandmother's estate, she was overwhelmed by a mix of nostalgia and unease. It had been over a decade since she last saw the small, isolated house on Whispering Pines Road. The memories of childhood summers came flooding back, the old house surrounded by dense woods, where the trees whispered secrets in the wind. The house stood as she remembered, with ivy creeping up the peeling white paint. The front porch creaked under her feet, and the familiar scent of lavender greeted her when she unlocked the door. Abby spent the afternoon sorting through her grandmother's belongings, the shadows growing longer as night fell. She lit a fire to chase away the cold and poured herself a glass of wine. Her grandmother used to tell her stories about the forest, warning her never to venture too deep. The trees have secrets, she would say, her eyes serious, and they'll share them if you listen. The warnings had always seemed like fairy tales, but that night, Abby felt a chill she couldn't shake. By 10 p.m., the house was unnervingly quiet. Abby went to bed, leaving her flashlight and phone on the nightstand. The whispers began around midnight, so faint at first she thought she imagined them. But soon they grew louder. "Abby, come to us." She sat up, heart pounding, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. Grabbing her flashlight, she peered out the window but saw nothing. Yet the voices continued, persistent and chilling. Shaking, she called her friend Emily. "Emily, I'm hearing voices outside," Abby whispered. Emily, groggy, tried to reassure her. "It's probably just your imagination," she said. "Lock the doors and call me if it gets worse." Abby double-checked the locks, but the unease remained. Unable to sleep, she lay in bed, her pulse racing. Around 3 a.m., a loud thump jolted her awake. The flashlight in her hand shook as she listened. Another noise echoed from downstairs. She crept to the door and peered down the dark staircase, spotting the front door swinging open in the wind. Her phone trembled in her grasp as she called Emily again. "Someone's in the house," she whispered. "Call the police," Emily urged. But before she could, Abby heard slow, deliberate footsteps ascending the stairs. She killed the flashlight and pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath. The footsteps grew closer, pausing outside her door. The knob turned, and the door creaked open. A tall shadow stood in the doorway. "Abby," it whispered, its voice low and mournful. Abby's grip tightened on the flashlight. "Please," she begged, "leave me alone." The shadow lingered for a moment before retreating. Abby didn't wait. She opened the window, climbed onto the roof, and scrambled down, landing hard on the ground. She sprinted through the yard, the whispers following her into the woods. "Abby, come to us." Her flashlight wavered as she ran, branches slapping at her face. She didn't stop until she reached the old church at the edge of town. The doors gave way, and she collapsed inside, her hands shaking as she called 911. The dispatcher promised help was on the way. The police found Abby the next morning, curled up on the cold stone floor of the church. She tried to explain, but they blamed stress and exhaustion. They searched the house but found nothing. Before leaving Cedar Hollow, Abby visited the Whispering Pines Cemetery, where her grandmother was buried. Kneeling beside the grave, she whispered, "I think I understand now, Grandma. The trees really do have secrets." The wind rustled through the pines, and Abby swore she heard a familiar voice, soft and warning. "Be careful, child." As she turned to leave, a shiver ran down her spine, as if unseen eyes were watching from the forest. Abby left Cedar Hollow that day, vowing never to return. Yet deep in the woods, the whispers lingered, waiting for someone else to hear them.